So I'm really happy to have the opportunity to speak to you today. I haven't been able to attend all of these conferences, but I did have the pleasure of attending in Santiago last year. Thank you. Thank you. And coincidentally, I will be talking about some of the work we've since done with the Chilean regulators on the update of their new mortality table. So that should be a good follow-up for some of the observations that were made last year for those of you who were in attendance. Part of my presentation, however, will draw from a publication we had on mortality assumptions and longevity risk. Just to briefly summarize what this report intended to do, it first looked at the regulation in various countries with respect to the mortality assumptions used to value pension and annuity liabilities, and then looked at these tables to assess the adequacy of the assumptions given the recent improvements we've observed, mortality improvements we've observed in these countries. And finally, it concludes with a discussion of management of longevity risk and some policy implications on how to encourage the management and measurement of this risk and facilitate its mitigation. And so I won't go into all of this today. I think we did have some of these books available in the break rooms for if you want to look through it in more detail. But today I will be focusing more on the assessment of the adequacy of the standard mortality tables used and some of the assumptions we had to take to make this assessment, and focus more specifically about the assessment for Chile and some of the challenges that they have faced in updating their mortality tables and assumptions. I'll conclude briefly with some policy implications to address the expected longevity risk of these tables. But first of all, I want to make some key distinctions in the aspects of both mortality assumptions and longevity risks that I'll be discussing. First of all, with respect to mortality assumptions, it's clear we have to set two aspects of these assumptions. First is the level of mortality that is being experienced today. Secondly is the improvement and the extent to which we expect life expectancy to continue to improve in the future. With respect to longevity risk, I want to distinguish between expected risk and unexpected risk, as these two are commonly just grouped into, broadly speaking, longevity risk. But I make this distinction with expected risk, which is really the gap between what is currently being assumed and what we could reasonably expect given what's been happening in the population. And unexpected risk would be the impact of mortality improvements beyond what we reasonably expect. And I make this distinction both because they need to be addressed in different ways, and they imply different policy measures which need to be taken to address these risks. So expected risk needs to be addressed by making sure the mortality assumptions used are appropriate. Unexpected risk can be managed, for example, through capital requirements or passing this risk to a third party. Also, just to emphasize that especially for policymakers, it's really important that the expected longevity be addressed before unexpected longevity risk, because if your baseline assumptions aren't appropriate, you're likely going to be underestimating the exposure to unexpected longevity risk as well. For example, assessing the financial impact of a 25% decrease in mortality is going to be much different if you're assuming improvements or not. And furthermore, if your best estimates aren't in line with expectations of the market, any option to mitigate that unexpected risk is going to seem prohibitively expensive. So as I mentioned, we looked at several of the standard mortality tables used in 15 countries for both pension plans and annuity providers, and assessed their adequacy given the recent improvements experienced in these countries. And I won't focus so much on the results here, I'll go into the methodology, but the tables with the most serious expected longevity risk, which is what we're quantifying here, were the ones that do not assume any mortality improvement at all. And this assessment was partly driven by the observation that many countries do not actually require that mortality improvements be taken into account in mortality tables. And a lot of these tables were really outdated. So going into how exactly we quantified this risk, we looked at the annuity values based on the standard tables and those based on alternative mortality projections. So essentially quantifying the potential shortfall in provisions if these provisions are based on the standard mortality tables. And for these alternative projection models, we implemented 4 different models to have a varying views: the Lee-Carter model, the Carnes-Blake-Dowd model, the P-spline, and the CMI model. We did calibrate these models using the general population data, as this is clearly the most widely available data. But the problem with putting in general population to these models is that we get out general population data from the models. But we're really trying to quantify here is the potential expected longevity risk of these mortality tables for the pensioner and annuitant populations, which are typically subgroups of the general population who have a much higher life expectancy, driven largely by differences in socioeconomic factors, but is also driven by the underlying structure of the pension system itself. Just to illustrate the differences in the population mortality versus pensioner mortality, these figures show the life expectancy at age 65 for the population and for the pensioners or annuitants based on several of the standard mortality tables which we assessed. And so we can see the red bar represents the additional life expectancy that pensioners or annuitants can expect compared to the population, which for these tables is around, on average, an additional 2 years. This does vary by the structure of the scheme or pension system which these tables are applied. We can see, for example, in the Netherlands and Canada, where the coverages for these pension systems are quite large, the difference between pensioner and population mortality is relatively small. Whereas if we look at France, where these tables for annuitants are really for the private funded pensions, this difference is quite a bit larger. The green bars just represent the additional life expectancy when we account for future mortality improvements. So the blue and red is really period life expectancy. The green bars account for future mortality improvements. And that here, on average, it adds an additional about 1.5 years of life expectancy. So given these differences between pensioner and population mortality, it is necessary that we adjust the model outputs in order to be able to quantify this expected longevity risk of the mortality tables. And we do this by basing this adjustment on the initial pensioner or annuitant mortality, which has most recently been observed. Typically, this is based on the mortality which the standard mortality table was based, or the initial year given by the standard mortality table. So for example, in Chile, the 2009 table for pensioners, the initial mortality was established for 2009. We adjust the projected mortality from the models in 2009 to the level of that given by the standard mortality table in 2009, then assume that the improvement factors given by the projection models apply to that level. So we can then compare directly the annuity value from the adjusted model outputs to the annuity value of the standard mortality table to quantify that expected longevity risk. And this is the expected longevity risk driven only by the difference in mortality improvement assumptions, since we are starting from the same starting point. But there's a lot of assumptions that have to go into this to believe that these quantifications are accurate. First of all, that the initial level of mortality is appropriate and accurate as set by the mortality table. And this is clearly not always the case. Particularly some of the tables we assessed that were used in some countries were actually based on a different country's population. So in those cases, we had to find an alternative source of pensioner or annuitant mortality. Other mortality tables can incorporate somewhat subjective adjustments to the level. For example, the tables that have been developed in Spain base the adjustment to the level adjustment on the difference between pensioners and annuitants, population and pensioner mortality in Switzerland. So there are issues like that can challenge the accuracy of these quantifications. Another assumption is that the historical data that we use to calibrate the models is appropriate for projecting forward and assessing the trend, a future mortality trend. And this is particularly a problem for countries where we had very limited data. Korea is a good example for this. We had quite a limited time series on which to base our assessment for Korea. But Korea is a country with very low life expectancy compared to other OECD countries. And during the time where we had the historical experience available, it has also been developing quite rapidly economically and also experiencing quite high mortality improvements of around 4 to 5%. So clearly, when we use this data to calibrate the models, those very high improvements are going to be continued to project in the future. Whereas more realistically, once Korea achieves the levels of life expectancy observed in other OECD countries, we could expect these improvements to come down as well to the levels observed in other countries. So in that respect, we're probably overestimating somewhat the risk for these countries. Another assumption that was alluded to earlier is the extent to which mortality improvements of pensioners and insureds will follow that of the general population, because there is some evidence that not only do higher socioeconomic groups have higher life expectancy, but they may also experience higher levels of mortality improvement. And so in this case, basing our assessment on the general population may underestimate somewhat the future projected longevity. And finally, the assumed discount rate has a huge impact on the quantification of this risk. For our assessment, we assumed a rate of 4.5%, which in the current low interest rate environment is probably a bit high. So we also did a sensitivity of our assessment, reducing the discount rate to 2%. And this table, it's kind of hard to see, but this is for all the standard mortality tables that we assessed for females. And the light green bars represent the additional expected shortfall that we quantified when reducing the discount rate from 4.5 to 2%. So on average, increases the exposure by 1 to 2%, but for mortality tables, it's already had a significant level of longevity risk. This sensitivity to the discount rate is much larger. So exposure to longevity risk does increase in low interest rate environments. Moving more specifically to the assessment of the Chilean pensioner table, the first charts on the left show the historical mortality improvements which have been experienced by the Chilean population compared to the mortality assumptions which were assumed in the pensioner table for 2009. And so the Chilean population experienced extremely high improvements in the 70s, 80s. These have since come down a bit to about 2% more recently. But you can see in the far right column that the assumptions in the pensioner table were more than half of that at 0.7% on average. So when we looked at this, it was pretty clear that, these improvement assumptions are probably underestimating future longevity. When we compare this with the outputs of the Lee-Carter and the CMI model, we estimated this risk to be around 4 or 5%. Following this assessment, the Chilean regulators asked the OECD to assist them in updating their pensioner, all of their mortality tables, including the pensioner mortality table for 2014. And this is an exercise that the Chilean regulators undertake every 5 or 6 years. And the objective of this was to update the level of mortality to the current level observed for pensioners in Chile, and also to incorporate mortality improvement assumptions which are more reasonable given the recent improvements observed in the Chilean population. Just to give you a brief idea of what these mortality tables are used for, the Chilean pension system is a mandatory defined contribution plan. When individuals reach retirement, they have the option of using their accumulated assets to either purchase a life annuity from an insurance company or to take program withdrawals. So the pensioner tables have two main purposes. First of all, they're used to calculate the insurance reserves for annuities. Secondly, they're used to calculate the allowed program withdrawal for individuals who have selected that option. So the purpose of these tables is really to be accurate in terms of best estimate as possible, so as not to be overly conservative and penalize the pensioners as well. The draft of these updated tables were published for consultation in March, and the regulators received a lot of challenges from the industry, particularly with respect to the use of the general population data to calibrate the mortality improvement assumptions. And the industry was argued that pensioners have experienced a much lower rate of improvement than the population, as well as disabled populations, which is somewhat contrary to what we would expect given the overall higher socioeconomic and income levels of the pensioner population. So why were they saying this? Well, if we look at the updated level of mortality between 2009 tables and the 2014 tables, we can compute the mortality improvement implied by that update. And this is shown by the blue line here. We can see it's actually negative for many ages for females, which means that the mortality tables were revised upward. And the expected mortality improvements, which we were projected, which is shown by the red line, were not realized during this period. And so our actual initial assessment of the shortfall of the tables was off in this respect. But this seems quite odd as well. So we looked more into the explanations for this revision upward in the mortality rates. So the regulators broke down the pensioner mortality by income levels. And this shows, you can see the first quartile is those with the lowest income, and the fourth quartile are the pensioners with the highest income. So there is a significant difference in mortality for these different income groups, which is expected and is widely observed in a lot of scenarios. But looking at the makeup of the total pensioner population, so this shows the proportion of each of the income quartiles making up the total pensioner population, and we can see the red line is the lowest income, and the proportion of the proportion of the lowest income population of the total population of pensioners was decreasing up until around 2007. In 2008, there was a pension reform in Chile which increased coverage for the lowest income pensioners. And so we can see clearly from 2008, this group has been increasing as a proportion of the total pensioners in Chile. Given the differences in mortality, given that they're forming now a bigger part of the pensioners, we can also expect the overall mortality of the pensioners during this period to increase as well. The same thing occurred with the disabled pensioners. I realize these graphs aren't best to see the trend, but the pension reform of 2008 also removed a 3-year waiting period for the disabled population. And so this had the effect of significantly increasing mortality for disabled population since 2009. Whereas when this effect is removed, that is no longer observed. So I guess this is more just to emphasize that when assessing mortality trends, particularly on subpopulations of the group, it's really important to be aware of any externalities that could impact the observed trend, which might not necessarily be representative of the actual underlying trend. So in the end, we were much more comfortable relying on the mortality improvements of the general population for the updated tables. as this population is much more stable in terms of demographic mix, and we'll feel that this will be more representative of the true mortality improvements experienced by the pensioners going forward. So in addition to some more founded criticisms of these tables, there were also several comparisons that were made by the industry that were more to incite some, well, debate, I guess, among the general population. There was one actual headline in the newspaper saying that the regulators are now saying that Chileans are living longer than the Japanese. This comparison clearly was failing to account for the differences between period and cohort life expectancy, and it was as well as the difference between population and pensioner life expectancy. It was comparing the period life expectancy of Japanese to the Chilean life expectancy in the pensioner tables. And another comparison was made that this is clearly not right, because no one in Chile has a life expectancy of 110. So showing the confusion between the maximum survival that's assumed in the tables and average survival. But just to say that given that these types of comparisons are actually making headlines in the newspaper, it highlights that these types of arguments and comparisons resonate with people who are not so familiar with the dynamics of mortality and life expectancy. And so when we communicate on these topics, it's really important to be clear in what we're comparing and educate the population so people have a better understanding of what these figures mean. Moving back to the report, the report put forward several policy implications as a result of our analysis and research, some of which relate directly to expected longevity risk and others which relate more to unexpected risk. So expected risk to make sure mortality assumptions used are appropriate for the populations which they are used for, and unexpected risk more around making sure the capital and accounting frameworks account for the risk and facilitating its management. But as today I'm focusing more on expected risk, I'll focus more on these policy implications here. The first important thing for policymakers to ensure is that the mortality tables used for valuing pension funds and annuities or pension and annuity liabilities are appropriate. They need to require that future mortality improvements be accounted for, that they are regularly updated to ensure experience is in line with expectations, and as well to be based on the relevant population when establishing the level of mortality. And the extent that regulators take charge themselves to develop these tables, they also need to make sure that these points are followed as they do in Chile. Okay. And finally, that's very important that accurate and timely mortality data be made available in order to facilitate the measurement of mortality. It would be extremely useful to governments for also provide this mortality by providing with a socioeconomic indicator, given the differences we observe in mortality for these different populations. And this is surprisingly not commonly done, even despite these differences observed. But this work has a lot of implications about the trend for governments now to link the pensionable age to life expectancy. This is something we want to look at more closely in our future work at the OECD, because given the differences in socioeconomic life expectancy across socioeconomic groups, simply linking pensionable age to average life expectancy could result in a regressive system. And so we want to look more at how we can ensure the sustainability of pension systems in light of the increasing life expectancy, while still ensuring that these systems remain equitable across socioeconomic groups. And so I'm really looking forward to Mr. Lee's presentation next. I hope you'll enlighten us on some of these issues. Thank you.
You show us the impact of interest rate. Do you consider the inflation risk, and more generally, what's your point of view on inflation risk and for pensioners?
In fact, all of our assessment was based on level annuities, so we did not consider that these annuities increase with inflation. But I don't think that the sensitivity to the discount rate would change if we did consider inflation. But that's really something for the pension system itself to address, because I think the UK, the demand, while inflation annuities, for example, are available, the demand for them remains quite low. And that's a question of the communication of the impact that inflation can have on your purchasing power. And there have been studies that have shown that when you actually show that impact on purchasing power, that the people are more likely to choose inflation-linked annuities, for example.